Hi, my name is Rodney Fowler, and I'm here to talk to you today about IPM Invoicing 201. In today's discussion, I'm going to make the assumption that you're already familiar with the elements covered in IPM 101 and basic navigation and flow of the program, specifically as it pertains to data entry with the time of employees. I'm going to begin today's discussion on the Administration tab. Now, the Administration tab is effectively comparable to the Lacerte user options or to the QuickBooks Customize area. Various elements of the Administration tab play into the invoicing process. Some of them play in much more than others, and I'm going to be trying to discuss them in order of priority. I'm going to start today's discussion on the Client Manager section. When I select Client Manager, you'll see a list of my clients come up. You'll notice that some clients are linked to both Lacerte and QuickBooks clients, and others are only linked to Lacerte. It's very important that if you plan on posting invoices or time back to QuickBooks, that every client have an association to QuickBooks. Effectively, when you hand information back to QuickBooks from IPM, the QuickBooks program is going to need to associate that with the customer that you have inside the QuickBooks program. And this is what associates the IPM client to the customer within QuickBooks. Basically, every client that you wish to post time or invoices for should have a QuickBooks association. If you do not plan on posting time or invoices for those clients back to QuickBooks, then it does not need an invoice association. A QuickBooks association. It is not critical that clients have a Lacerte association. In other words, if you have a client that you do accounting work for but do no tax work for, then there's no reason to have a Lacerte association on that client. The second most critical aspect of the Administration tab is the Users section. Users are also a critical aspect to link back to QuickBooks inside the Intuit Practice Management program for a very similar reason that linking clients is. When you hand information such as time or invoices back to QuickBooks, it's going to need to know who did that time, and the way QuickBooks associates that time from the user inside IPM is through the QuickBooks employee, which can be stipulated underneath a particular user. If you look at this screen in the background, all users, I should say, that have accepted invites into the Intuit Practice Management program display. If I select a particular user, then I will get a user information card that appears. Here, I can tie that particular user to a Lacerte preparer, and that's necessary for engagement tracking, or I can tie them to a QuickBooks employee or QuickBooks vendor. Now, if I'm posting time or invoices back to QuickBooks for an employee, I should specify a QuickBooks employee in this area. You do that by simply clicking the down arrow, and you'll see the employee list that automatically pulls up from QuickBooks. If you plan on posting time or invoices back to QuickBooks for a 1099 contractor, then you can specify that information here. It's also necessary to tie an employee to a vendor if you plan on reimbursing that employee for any expenses that were paid out of pocket, such as something charged on a personal credit card or something of that nature. If you scroll down inside the screen, you will also see an area where you can stipulate staff billing rates. Now, staff billing rates don't necessarily tie the employee to the QuickBooks employee, but it is the default that is used by the program to stipulate the hourly billing rate for that particular user, and it's the default that we use to prepare the invoice. You will generally want to stipulate at least a standard rate and a cost per hour for each employee. In general, I would suggest that your cost per hour also include the hourly cost of any benefits that you pay that employee, so you can get a true cost of that employee's time. Off the alternate rates, rates B, C, D, and E, you may stipulate things such as negotiated rates or charity rates if you have those. If you save those changes and close that screen, it will basically tie the link back to the QuickBooks employee inside QuickBooks so that you can post their time or invoices over. And it will also set up the default billing within the program that we'll be using for calculating our invoices. I'll move on to work codes. Work codes are effectively how Intuit Practice Management recognizes service items from QuickBooks, the type of work you do. And just like clients and users, they have to be associated back to QuickBooks elements in order for QuickBooks to understand the type of work being done. If you're going to post time or invoices back to QuickBooks, it's also important that you basically tie the work code inside IPM to a service item inside QuickBooks. This can actually be done in two ways for work codes. One way is to actually go into a particular work code and basically, after setting it up, down at the bottom, stipulate the item that it ties to within QuickBooks. If you click the down arrow on the items area, then you will see the service items that are inside QuickBooks, and you will be able to select the service item tying the work code above to the service item inside QuickBooks. Off the next sync, the standard rate that is applied to that particular work code will automatically slide up and post inside IPM so that you can use it if you wish for alternate billing inside the invoicing program. Although our default is to bill by user's rate per hour, you can also bill by the type of work done per hour inside the IPM program. And I'll show you how to modify that in a bit. In general, I find tying specific work codes back to specific service items to be somewhat tedious if you have a fairly long list, and therefore I generally suggest that that's not the way to go about this. What I would suggest doing is going into QuickBooks and making sure that you have a very robust list of all the work that you do within the firm. You can use the default list that we provide in IPM as a guide to see if you basically perform all those functions. Now here I do not have the default list, but the idea is basically the same. If you look at something like write-up, verify that you have a write-up service item for it inside QuickBooks, and make sure that item is set up correctly inside QuickBooks. If you don't have write-up, skip it and proceed to the next one. If you do have write-up, when you verified that it is there, go ahead and go on to the next one there as well. The items that we normally find that clients are missing inside their QuickBooks service items are things such as vacation, personal time off, sick time, etc. That's because those things aren't really service items. They aren't actually work that you perform inside the firm. However, it's things that your employees will need to code against in order to track their time inside IPM, and therefore they will need to be set up as service items. Once your service item list is robust and complete inside QuickBooks, then you can move up to the top of the screen and say, click here to replace these items with your QuickBooks service items. It will ask if you're sure, and if you say yes, it will overwrite your work codes with the service items from QuickBooks and automatically establish those links for you. I'm going to move on to expense codes. Expense codes are effectively the fourth item that really needs to be tied together in order to post time and invoices back to QuickBooks. Expense codes effectively work the same way that work codes do, except there's no way to import them en masse. Fortunately, there can be fewer of them. So let's go ahead and select a specific expense code and we'll open it up. Every expense code will have to be tied back to either an expense account, which is shown on the left up here, or to a service item, shown on the right, inside QuickBooks. This is how QuickBooks knows what to apply that expense code inside IPM to an account or service item inside QuickBooks. It's through this association. Now this is a mutually exclusive item, so you either choose an account, an expense account, or a service item to post it against. Notice that you will also be able to mark it up so that you can mark up an expense that you may have incurred, so that will slide through the invoice at a marked up rate. You can make it taxable, and you can specify that you need to calculate certain unit per measure or something of that nature. Down at the bottom, you have the ability to mark it as a service fee. In general, if you want a client to be reimbursed for this, then you would not mark it as service fee. Otherwise, you can mark it as service fee. If the item is marked as a service fee or not, it doesn't really matter. It will slide through and impact the invoice. And it will be part of WIP, and you can include it on the invoice and therefore get paid for it. You will always want to choose that it is an employee expense. That allows your employees to actually record that expense on their dashboards. Now, there's some other areas that, although they do not directly impact invoicing inside IPM, they do play a part in impacting invoicing inside IPM. So I'd like to basically do a segue and go into those for a moment. First, let's go to General Settings. Inside General Settings, there are various aspects that can indirectly impact the invoice, as well as some aspects that directly impact the invoice in IPM. First, let's talk about the timesheet. The timesheet basically establishes what you are seeing inside the dashboard area. The defaults that come with the program, I believe, are for Grid 1 Simple or Spreadsheet 1 Simple. In general, I would suggest that you choose something that has an engagement on it, and probably it has something with a timer on it as well. Either a Spreadsheet 3 engagement with timer or Grid 4 engagement plus timer. In general, I think we'd suggest that you would want to go with the Grid 4 engagement first plus timer because it's a little easier layout to follow. If you choose Grid 4 engagement plus timer, then on your dashboard, I'll go ahead and save that. On your dashboard, you should see that the the client appears here, the engagement appears below, and the particular work code that you're coding it against appears down below as well. Then you can go over and actually record your time. The reason why this is important is because there's no way to provide an engagement link after you have submitted time from the dashboard. So if you haven't done that at the time of submission, there's no way to go back and put it in there. And if you haven't been doing it and then go back to try to do it later, then you'll find that you cannot run profitability reports by engagements. In general, I would suggest leaving your expense forms alone at Spreadsheet 1 Simple. For how you would input time on your dashboard, take a look at your lookup style. We suggest that you would go with a standard or a name-only display. Start week on will determine which day your week starts on inside your dashboard. In general, it's Sunday or Monday. Your timesheet period honestly has very little impact inside IPM at this time. It's something that has been scaled out, and whether you choose monthly, bi-weekly, or anything else really has no impact. Time rounding can actually have a significant impact. Time rounding impacts two things. One, time that's submitted within the IPM application, and also the time that is applied to an invoice within an IPM application. These two things are very different, obviously, and therefore you want to make sure that you have a careful balance between the rounding that you're doing. What I mean by that is, let's say an employee works 10 minutes. If an employee works 10 minutes, then when they submit their time, it will automatically round that time up to 15 minutes for the point of invoicing, which normally makes sense. However, it will also round up the time that they worked for purposes of payroll calculation, if you post time back to QuickBooks, up to 15 minutes, which may not make sense. So please keep in mind that and choose accordingly. QuickBooks Class integration right now is not an element that we support inside IPM at the time of this recording, and therefore it is suggested that you not use it. Your invoice settings do directly impact your invoicing within IPM. There's basically two settings here that are going to be direct impacts. First, the default billing type. The default billing type is the invoice template that you will use in order to create invoices within IPM. By default, we go to time and materials. There are other templates that you can create and or use if you choose. However, time and materials is the one that will both incorporate time and expenses against your invoices. You do have the ability to write those items up once you get them on an invoice or in order to attach them on an invoice. But if you would prefer, you can create a fixed fee invoice, and then you could toggle that over here. by clicking on the down arrow. I do not have a fixed fee invoice set up at this time, therefore I cannot select that. We'll talk more about how to set up other invoice templates in a moment. Under the auto number settings, this is the number that is going to be applied to your invoice upon its creation. You will see there is a little guide here in the help area about how to go in and create that. In general, your master client ID is going to be the ID that is within IPM for that client. It is not going to be your Lacert client ID, so you will probably not want to include that on your invoice. You of course can include year, month, and then what you most likely will want to include is a series of P's for auto-implementing the ID. Client type is not so critical, so you probably will not want to choose that. And the client ID for invoice only, you would not want to include that. In other words, if I want a simple 5-digit number on my invoice, what you would need to put in to the ID format will be a series of P's. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And below, you would want to stipulate the value. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that will be the next value applied to the next invoice that I create. That is all that impacts invoicing within the program from the General Settings tab. Therefore, once you have made your settings on the General Settings screen, I would suggest going back up to the top and clicking on Save. It's very important that you save at periods within the Intuit Practice Management program. The next section that I would like to talk to you about is invoice templates. Here, the main idea is that you understand the capabilities of IPM, not so much that you understand how to create an invoice template. If you do understand how to create an invoice template in IPM, that's extra, that's wonderful. But the main goal is that you understand the capabilities of it so that you can call for assistance or anything like that should you need to. In order to show you those capabilities, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to create a fixed fee invoice. I'll just go ahead and title it fixed fee. I will tell it to post into an accounts receivable field. I can enter notes on it should I wish to do so. I will choose the WIP tracking and that I would like to track WIP. In general, that's something that you will want to do, of course. And then I will want to choose the QuickBooks format that I will use. This is actually a key feature inside IPM, and it really determines what information will appear on not only invoices printed from IPM, but also invoices that are posted back to QuickBooks. You'll notice that there is a default, a detail with staff, or detail no staff. There's also an expense detail only. In general, you're going to want to focus on these first three only, the default, detail with staff, or detail no staff. Since I'm creating a fixed fee invoice, and by definition it is kind of vague on details, I'm going to go ahead and choose a default invoice. Let me go ahead and save that information, and you'll see that a fixed fee invoice appears down below. If I click into the fixed fee invoice, I have the ability to go in and modify what will actually appear inside the fixed fee invoice. Here you will see that time charges are going to be calculated on the fixed fee invoice. This is a default setting within the Intuit Practice Management program. Obviously, time charges should not accrue on in fixed fee invoice, and therefore I am going to delete that item. Now I have no line items and no contract information applying to this particular invoice. If I were to try to prepare an invoice with this, it would basically calculate at 0. I do want to add a line item, so I'm going to go over here to add, and I've already created a fixed fee item here. So I'm going to select it to add it to the invoice. Let me show you some information about the line item. If I click into it, I will have the title of the line item. I'll be able to stipulate that it's a credit if necessary. I can tell it what service item I want this line item to post into QuickBooks, and that's pretty critical for posting information back to QuickBooks. Since it is not a time-related item, I have checked non-time. and I can tell it what posting period that I want to post it into, whether it be current period, previous period, next period, things of that nature. And then I can stipulate a line item formula for it. Now there are actually several formulas that we can use for line items inside the program, such things as combining time and expenses on a single line. In general, I would suggest that you not try to modify these and that you actually call support in order to do so. Once you've set up the invoice line item charges that you wish, you need to save those and then come down to the contract terms. Now, contract terms aren't necessary for every invoice. If you're doing a simple time and materials invoice, it's not necessary to stipulate contract terms on them. However, in a fixed fee invoice, you will need to stipulate the fixed fee that you have applied to the invoice, and you can do that here by clicking on Add, and I'm going to choose a fixed fee item that I've already set up. Contract terms are actually rather thin on information. If you select them, you will actually be able to select what they are and stipulate a sort order if necessary. However, there's no other information that you can apply at this time. Let's go ahead and save that so that my contract details include fixed fee items. Those fixed fees that I stipulate in the contracts will appear on the invoice, and the invoice now has been created and should appear as an option inside my system. I'm going to go ahead and save that information so that I can go back and use it later in this presentation. Engagement types do not impact invoicing. However, report settings do. If we jump down to report settings, you'll see that I can stipulate my company name, I can stipulate an address, city, state, and zip, stipulate my phone number. I can also put the default invoice type in here. Now, this default invoice is the invoice type that will be the default if you print an invoice from IPM, and it's only for printing from IPM. Also, other options that I can include on the invoice will be the due date of printed invoices and the terms on the printed invoices. Now, we still have some work to do on customizing our invoices when printed from the practice management program. To that end, basically at this time, you cannot create and upload a logo to your invoice. We are working on that, and that is something that should be fixed in the future. However, at this time, that is not a function. Therefore, although you can upload a logo in the program, it cannot be actually applied to the invoice. Nor can you modify the position of information on the invoice, such as aligning the address information to slip sheets so that you can print them and include them in invoices, or something of that nature. Just be aware of that when you're looking at possibly printing invoices from IPM. Right now, the program is really designed to post invoices back to QuickBooks, and then once posted back to QuickBooks, print a professional looking invoice from the QuickBooks program. And of course, QuickBooks has a great deal of customization that can be done to the invoices there. With that, basically we've concluded all the aspects of invoicing that are contained in the admin tab. I'm going to go ahead and talk about inputting time and jump over to your dashboard. Now, as we've discussed a little bit earlier, your dashboard is mainly controlled through your general settings in the admin section through the timesheet entry. Depending on the timesheet choices that you've chosen, you can go in here and put in time for a client, put in time for an engagement, stipulate the work code, and then actually stipulate the work that was done inside that day or week. You have the ability to delete that time, and you also have the ability to pin the time so that that information will roll over to the next week. A pin that has fallen over basically will not roll forward to the next week. A pin that is standing up will roll forward to the next week. Right. We do generally suggest that you flag timesheet cells that have notes and that you show both submitted and unsubmitted time. However, that's all I'm going to discuss on time here. For more information on that, please reference your 101 material. For our purposes, I've already submitted some time for a particular client that I have, and I'm going to be using that time from the work in progress inside the program to create invoices. I'm going to go ahead and go over to the time and billing section, which is where time that has been submitted flows inside the program. This is a section that basically the administrator or firm owner would have access to. Anybody that needs to do invoicing from IPM needs to be established as a firm owner, which you can think of as an administrator. Time submitted inside IPM effectively flows to two places inside the time and billing segment. First, it goes into the managed time and expenses. Once you've submitted time, your time will appear next to the particular individual that has submitted it for the period that is stipulated. Here you notice that I have 14.5 hours against Rodney Fowler. Basically, this allows me to go in and view the time and kind of look it over to see if I approve it. You don't really need to take this step in order to prepare invoices. However, if you want to remove time from the system, somebody entered an error, or if you need to modify that time, basically somebody entered it against the wrong client, then you can go back to the Manage Time and Expenses Collect area, select the particular time, and then drill into that specific time entry to make the changes that you need, changing it from between staff individuals, the type of work that was done, specifying a different client that was done, or changing the date that it was done. You may also change the amount of time that was worked during that period, or the rate that's being applied to that time. Once you've finished it, go ahead and save that information. Now, there are quite a few items that you need to drill into in order to change those settings, but keep in mind in properly flowing work office, this should be a rare event anyway. If you need to post timesheets back to QuickBooks for purposes of collecting payroll or sending out payroll, you may do so through the Post Timesheets area. Posting timesheets work very similar to posting invoices in the program back to QuickBooks. Again, you will need to make sure that your administrative options have all been set up correctly, namely that your clients have been tied together to QuickBooks clients, your users have QuickBooks employees stipulated, your work codes have service items that are stipulated for them, and your expense codes have either service items or expense accounts tied to them. Assuming all those things are done, then you can go over here and choose to post an item by clicking on it and then clicking Post. That will write that information back down to QuickBooks, and then it will basically incorporate that time on their system. There are options in the program for stipulating whether that time is marked as billable or non-billable. You also can post expenses back to the QuickBooks program by going to the Post Expenses area. Again, you need to stipulate the period that you're going to be doing that for. Here, I'm going to choose January, and I already have an expense entered. The only real reason why you need to post expenses is if you need to reimburse employees inside QuickBooks. And here you would basically just go over in a like manner to posting timesheets, select the check, and select Post. I'm going to go over to the second area of where time is posted in the program. I'm going to go to the Prepare Invoices screen, and when I select the Prepare Invoices screen, you will see a Getting Started area. Now, the Getting Started area has a lot of good information on it. However, we're going to be discussing most of that information in this presentation. The area of most interest to you will probably be your Create Draft section. In your Create Draft section, by default, you are basically entering into an accumulated WIP screen. The accumulated WIP screen will basically have all your unposted WIP and things that have not been applied to an invoice appear in it. Here you'll notice that I have Rush Detective Services that has $2,885 of time associated to it and $333 of expenses also associated with that. Now, one of the greatest strengths of Intuit Practice Management is its ability to flex to what the user wishes, namely that you can go in and do a very simple invoice where you're just basically attaching time and material to an invoice and billing the client for it. Or you can go in and produce a very detailed invoice that has many notes to it, things of that nature, and post that information over to QuickBooks as well to prepare an invoice. The difficulty is going to vary though. If you have a very difficult invoice or a detailed invoice that you're going to be posting through to QuickBooks, then obviously it will be more difficult to prepare and adjust than if you're going to be posting through a very simple invoice to QuickBooks. Let's take an example where we're preparing a very simple invoice to post back to QuickBooks, basically just a general line item invoice prepared with time and materials. You'll notice that your contract type, basically the invoice that you're going to be using, is over on the far right side. Here it's a time and materials invoice. The time and the expenses appear inside the invoice so that you can go in and modify them if you wish. However, in this situation, I'm going to make the assumption that I do not wish to adjust anything, that I want to bill the client for what I basically incurred as far as expenses, and also include in my billing rate for my work that has been performed. I'm going to go in and put a check next to Rush Detective Services. Now, you won't always get this, but in my situation I have 14.5 hours that's coming from time that falls outside of the time that I've stipulated over on the right. It is actually incorporated in this element here, in this value. I'm going to go ahead and say okay, that I want to include that accumulated WIP that has not been billed to the client in an invoice that I create. And then I'm going to go back and select Create Drafts. The program will do a calculation. And when it finishes, it's going to remove the work in progress from the Create Draft screen and associate it with an invoice that is now under the Finalized area. I will click Back, returning back to the Create Draft screen. And in there, you'll notice that the WIP for Rush Detective Services has now cleared. I'm now going to go over to the Finalize area where I have created the invoice for the client. And you will see that the total amount of the invoice appears down here, which basically includes the $2,885 in time plus the $333 of time expenses that have accrued. I'm going to go ahead and go into the invoice so that I can see it. And as I pull up that invoice, you will notice that I have my invoice number that has been stipulated. This is actually the second invoice that I've created for this client, so I am now going to 00002 as opposed to 0001, which I stipulated earlier in the video. I will be able to adjust the draft date if I wish to do that, backdate the invoice effectively. It shows my client, shows some of the information from my client, and down below I have basic line items for those clients. Time charges tied to an amount, expenses tied to an amount. If I only want to post a basic line item invoice over to QuickBooks, this is all I effectively need to do. I could go ahead and post this information by saving it and clicking back to go to the previous screen, and then putting a check on it and selecting Post. After the next sync, the invoice will appear inside QuickBooks. However, let's make the assumption that I actually want to make some changes to the invoice. Here, if I go back into the invoice, let me go back into the correct invoice. I will see the time charges and I have an amount. I see the expenses and have an amount. Let's assume that I want to add some notes to these line items as they flow through to QuickBooks. I may add these notes here. This note will basically be incorporated as part of the invoice and will post through to a description line inside QuickBooks. Unfortunately, at this time, descriptions that may have already been entered into QuickBooks do not post into QuickBooks, and do not post into IPM and cannot be actually attached to the IPM invoice, nor can you predefine a note that you might want to associate with the invoice. The best way to go about that, if you wish to do those things, in other words, have canned type messages that you want to apply to an invoice, is to create them in something like a Word or Excel doc that you can keep up on maybe a second screen. You can copy and paste them into here, and then those will retain and be posted down to QuickBooks. Once you have a note entered, you would basically just go up and click on Save, saving that note as part of the invoice. Now, one critical element of invoicing inside the Intuit Practice Management program is this format. We talked about formats a little bit earlier, namely there are 3 key formats that you'll want to keep in mind: default, detail with staff, detail no staff. If you're posting a simple line item type invoice over to QuickBooks, you want this to either be blank or set to default. That will basically post the information that is associated with the invoice detail, basically the information that you see on this screen, over to QuickBooks. If I go ahead and save that information and close it, I can then go back and put a check next to the item and post that item over to QuickBooks. After our processing, you'll see that the item has been posted to our back-end servers for basically downloading and syncing with QuickBooks. Now at this time the item will not appear inside QuickBooks because because QuickBooks hasn't gone through a syncing yet. I would just go ahead and click back and you'll see that it is posted as a pending item. In order to get the item to appear inside QuickBooks, I would need to go back and sync the information or wait for the automated sync to take place, and then the item will actually appear inside QuickBooks. Now I do have several other options. Let's assume that I don't want to create an invoice with just my default time for those particular users, that I actually do want to produce an invoice off the type of work that was done instead. In order to adjust the invoice so that I'm actually billing on the type of work that was being done, I need to return my accumulated WIP back to the Create Draft screen by deleting the invoice, and then I need to go into that particular client by selecting the hyperlink for the client information. What will appear is basically a default client information screen. This default client information screen is how you can establish rights that will apply throughout IPM to that client. For instance, I can stipulate the default invoice style for that client here. Notice that it's defaulted to time and materials, which is this default that I established in my admin screen under the general settings section. Here I can change it for this client so that I can then go down and post it as a fixed fee. Remember, I created a fixed fee invoice earlier in this discussion. When I stipulate the fixed fee, I get a new line for fixed fee that I can then go in there and overwrite, changing that item to whatever fixed fee it is, and then saving that information and closing it. If I were to go back and create the invoice from that, I would then create it at that fixed fee rate, and all the WIP that I've chosen to go into that invoice will roll forward into that invoice at the fixed fee rate, basically automatically adjusting itself out so that it will be the fixed fee amount. If I actually want to set up, in this case though, that I would be using a time and material invoice, I would need to go up here to the invoice settings section and change it over to the billing rates. Notice that the default billing rate is by the staff rate card. This is the information that you stipulated under the admin section in the users area when you double clicked on a user and went in there and set up the billing rates and the cost per hour. If you would rather have it stipulated by something else, I can go down here and choose that I want to bill the client as my activity rate, which is basically the rate of the type of work that was being done. In that, I can also stipulate which rate setting that I want to use, whether it's my standard rate or my alternate rates. Again, your alternate rates may be something like a negotiated rate, something like you contracted for that particular rate, or it may be some kind of charity rate that you've established inside either your users or your work areas. Once you've established that information, just save it and your invoices will automatically reflect that. Outside of that, billing by work code or activity rate is effectively the same as billing by the user rate. It just calculates different amounts. Now, let's say that you want to write up an invoice. There are several ways that you can write up an invoice inside IPM. First, let's say I just want to do a blanket write-up. This is $2,885.50, but I would rather it be $3,000. If you're just doing a basic write-up, I can jump over here and write up to $3,000. And let's say that the expenses are actually incorporated in that $3,000. I will write them down to 0. By doing this, what I've effectively done is applied the blanket write-up to the invoice, and what will happen is, based on a weighted average of the different elements of that invoice, the write-up amount will be applied to the weighted average to all the underlying work codes, or to the users that have participated in that, effectively spreading the amount of the write-up or write-down across the different types of work that were being done in there based on a weighted average. Let me go ahead and prepare an invoice with this. Again, I get my warning including time that was not within my period. And I'm going to go ahead and create a draft invoice. It will go through processing, and when completed, the WIP that is associated with that invoice will flow over to my finalize area. When I jump over there, you will see that I have an invoice for $3,000 written up from the $2,885.50. And if I drill into that invoice, again, basic line item just shows $3,000. Notice that since I wrote off my expenses, I no longer see them in the program. If I want to know how that item was written up, written down, and see the actual application of the weighted average, I can go over here to the time detail and see the adjustments that were made to the time to accumulate to the $114.50 that I needed to round up my $2,885.50 to $3,000. You can also take a look at your expense detail to see how the program adjusted it to write off the expenses. I'm going to go ahead and free this information back to WIP so that I can apply my write-up in a more detailed fashion. I'm going to go back to my Create Draft screen, and let's say I want my write-up to be a little bit more selective, that maybe some people did work that I feel was of more value than others. I'm going to return to my Create Drafts area and go into a green arrow here next to the time. In this area, I can basically write up various amounts so that they may only have the write-up applied to those specific things. Let's say that I wanted to apply the $114.50 to consulting services because those are my most value add. If that's the case, I'll go in here and apply my $114.50 to $1,194.50 and then save that information by scrolling down to the bottom and clicking on Submit. What will happen is it will calculate the invoice, and you notice I apparently was off slightly. It came out to $3,001. But now, if I step back over to my time detail, you will see that the total amount of the invoice write-up went against consulting services, and that none of my other items were impacted by my write-up. Therefore, if I'm going to go back and run a profitability or productivity report, it will reflect on that particular user's amount and for that particular type of work that was done. Right. One other thing I'd like to show is how to associate specific time to a invoice. Again, I'm going to free that time up so that it returns back over to the Create Draft screen. I have the same time entry, $2,885.50, and I have the same expenses. But let's say I only want part of that time to flow through the invoice. In other words, if I go in and look at the detail of the time that has been submitted for that invoice, I will see that there's tax preparation work, consulting services, and bookkeeping work. Let's assume that the consulting services and bookkeeping work were not part of the tax work that I needed to do, and that I really just want to build a client for the tax work. There's two different ways to do that. One, I can go through and put check marks in this area for the items that I would like to associate with the invoice. Doing it this way, and then going up to create invoice, will associate those particular work codes with the invoice, flowing through to the finalized invoice. Click on Open Invoices. You'll see my time charges, and my time charges have been applied to the amount. If I go into your time detail, you will see how what charges have been applied, and notice that it's only my tax preparation work. Let me go back to Invoice Detail and delete this one so that I can show you the other method of attaching those time entries to a specific invoice. Inside the Create Draft screen, I may also go over to the little green arrow. The green arrow gives me another way of associating only specific types of work codes to an invoice. The details are a little bit lacking in this screen though. What it's going to do in this screen is accumulate the totals for all your work codes together. Here I see that there's consulting services, bookkeeping, and tax preparation. Since I know that my consulting services and my bookkeeping were not associated with the tax preparation that I want to basically send through to the client or create the invoice for to the client, I'll go down here and choose that they should be held back in WIP. And then when I scroll to the bottom of the screen, I can click on Submit, and again my invoice will be created with only the items that I've chosen to flow through to the invoice, holding back my consulting services and bookkeeping, and just preparing it with my time charges and my expenses. Now, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and point out a best practice. Here, I'm looking at notes and periods, and then I can go in and put in credits for various items for the amounts for preparing an invoice. But in general, what you're going to want to do is probably look at your QuickBooks details, since most of you will be posting this information over to QuickBooks and preparing the invoice from there. When I click QuickBooks Details, you'll notice that the columns change so that I can see the QuickBooks items. This is a very important feature. Basically, it's important that you can see the association of QuickBooks items so you know where you're posting your time down. It is not uncommon when you're combining various different work codes into a specific line item that the nature of the work done for those work codes is lost. Here, if I were combining the 4 different items that were applied to this particular invoice into one line, as I was doing a little earlier, you would see that the items that it would post to through the format of default would just be whatever item is appearing in this line. Just make sure that that is what you want when you're posting information back to QuickBooks. Now, there's 2 different ways, as we've discussed, to really get an invoice out of the program. The suggested way is to post the information back to QuickBooks and produce a very professional invoice from there. Alternatively, you may print an invoice from within the Intuit Practice Management program, and you can do that by going up and clicking on the print icon and then stipulating the type of report that you would like to run. Now, if you only need a basic line item invoice, make sure that you only choose that particular type of invoice. Here I'm going to choose lines plus expenses and try to print that. What we'll print is a PDF version of the invoice, and then you can basically either print it out and send it on to the client, or you can turn around and just save it to the desktop and send it on to the client. Certain elements right now are not fixable, namely that the indentation next to your address information, firm name and address, cannot be corrected at this time. That is something that we're working on. It's in preparation for a logo that will eventually appear next to your name. There are other invoice presentations that you can of course run with. After I've prepared an invoice, going back to the finalized screen and going back into that particular invoice, if I click on print, I could click the down arrow and choose to show a very detailed multi-paged invoice. A detailed multi-page invoice is actually going to prepare not only the amounts of the figures appearing on the invoice, here the time charges and expenses, but on another page we'll break out those time charges as to what they actually are, accumulating them, and then show your expenses for what they actually are, accumulating those as well. That concludes the basic presentation of Invoicing 201. I plan on posting some other information out there for how to basically prepare detailed invoices and give some tips and tricks around that as well. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and we would appreciate any feedback. As always, if you need any assistance, please do not hesitate to give us a call.